Good evening. Ladies and gentlemen, can I ask you, please feel free to move up. That really so few of you.
Far away.
Yeah, because I think at the end of this session, if you have some questions, we'd like to see you and we'll welcome your questions. First of all, thank you for attending the concert and a big welcome to Mr. Pavlo Beznosiuk from London. We thought we'd have this short session just to share with you a little bit about what's happening tonight and some of the thoughts which are going through Pavlo's mind about the concert and actually the whole week he spent with Resound. Pavlo, as you know, is a very well-known Baroque violinist. He's led many period music groups, as well as playing in other symphonies orchestras like the LSO, and doing recordings for film and other things. But this week, Pavlo has led a chamber orchestra, a young Singaporean chamber orchestra, which is playing on modern instruments, not playing on gut strings or Baroque bows, in a program of Handel, Haydn, and Beethoven. So my first question, if I may, is, Pavlo, what goes through your mind when you're working with a modern instrument group on a program like this?
In general, a modern instrument group, well, one can't generalize because Resound is a modern instrument group with a certain ethos and a certain culture to it, a very rewarding and interesting culture. It's maybe not the same as a modern instrument group called the Academy of St. Martin in the Fields, or another one called Apollo Chamber Orchestra, or anything like that. So it's all about the individuals involved, really. But I realize that's not quite what you're asking. It's this whole maybe false dichotomy between modern instruments versus old instruments. I think one starts off a week such as this trying to get rid of preconceptions about what I might be asking for. People tend to have a view of the historically informed performance world as being populated by sort of mullahs for a certain way, or high priests of a certain approach to music. And it's important that you realize that people who play early instruments aren't doing it because it's the right way, because you're on a hiding to nothing with that anyway. There is no right way. We just do it because we kind of like how the instruments sound. We like some of the quirky characteristics of old wind instruments, for example. The notoriously unstable and difficult to play Baroque bassoon, for example, is a marvel. First of all, it's amazing to find players who can make it work and actually sound like a musical instrument. Whereas a modern bassoon, certain things about the construction and the mechanics on it have evened out so some of the difficulties and the idiosyncrasies of it. Similarly with oboes of the time, and certainly the brass instruments, where in the olden times, the 17th and 18th centuries, players changed notes merely by using the pressure and various tricks with their lips. They were able to play, for example, in the clarino register very high of the trumpet, without the benefit of vowels. And those instruments have a very particular sound, a very particular tuning to them. Anyway, that's all not there when one starts a rehearsal period with modern instruments. So do you sit down and ask the wind players, well, can you make that note out of tune? No, of course you don't. Can you make that note much quieter than that one because it's not meant to be as that? No, of course you don't. You try and impart the spirit of the age and what we can glean about typical ideas to do with phrasing and sound world and speeds, for example, rather than mimicking, trying to mimic the sound of old instruments. There's no real point to that. And modern instruments have huge advantages. They really do. There's a reason why the Baroque violin died out. It's not because a modern instrument is better. It's just it works. It's easier. Quite frankly, a gut E string which doesn't squeak in humidity like this. Even some metal strings squeak in humidity like this. But no, we've just taken the approach that there are certain concepts to do with speed, with volume, the sort of general size of the orchestra, and the general approach that we can bring forth on modern instruments. You're going to see 3 works performed tonight. So you're going to hear 3 works, I should say so, with different sizes of band, which are kind of typical. We start with a very small band, only 4 violins, this size, 4 violins, that side. For the concerto grosso, expand for the Haydn, and whereas our maximum strength for the Beethoven. That in itself is a nod to historically informed practice. Yeah.
Thank you. The other thing that, well, many of you I recognize have been to our concerts, but some of you might be wondering, where's the guy with the stick? Oh, yeah. Especially for the fact that we're playing a Beethoven symphony, a fairly large-scale work, but without the guy with the stick.
Yes, well, as you know, Mervyn, the guy with the stick really didn't exist before the age of Mendelssohn. Mendelssohn was the first really to, instigate the notion of somebody being involved with the music who wasn't making music. This is the thing. Beethoven, on occasion, directed his symphonies, but from the keyboard. That was his instrument. Haydn directed symphonies. Most people think he was playing the piano, but actually in the early days in Esterházy, he was also playing the violin. He led from the violin. This is composers directing their own work, of course. In the case of Mendelssohn, I forget what the piece was, it must have been one of those big oratorios, he conducted with a rolled up piece of manuscript paper. So still no stick. I suppose the notable exception to all that is the figure of Jean-Baptiste Lully in France, who beat time with a stick. But he was directing an opera band and trying to keep control of large groups of singers, large groups of dancers with heavy shoes on wooden stages and unruly French musicians. So he kind of needed the stick, and it just became part of the percussion section. For my own part, directing from the violin is a very particular skill. I'm not claiming to have got it completely nailed yet, but it's important to know when you're directing that the kind of gestures that a wind player needs, that a timpanist needs, or a trumpet player needs, and if you're playing a brass instrument, it's a little bit like walking a tightrope. There is no room for error. You either play or you don't play, and it needs to be at the right place. So there's a very particular kind of lead that you need to give a brass player to help them along, because if it's wrong, everybody knows about it. But those gestures are typically not the gestures one uses to play the violin beautifully. And that's where the dichotomy comes. So if you're not careful and you're thrashing around too much or sort of straining your arms too much, then you go to play a nice cantabile melody or something like that, and you find what happened, and your arm feels like a club. So keeping keeping rhythmic gesture crisp and clear for all the assembled musicians, and still being able to play properly, is where the difficulty lies.
Without hanging out too much of our dirty laundry, what were some of the particular challenges working with a young orchestra like this and three quite distinct pieces?
Well, I suppose just getting my ideas about the three different distinct styles really clearly to come across. I think a general point I would say is that for better or worse, the aesthetics of modern instrumental playing often, not always, but often have at their core, or at least certainly quite near their core, the notion of evenness. For example, a bass player presented with a very awkward, angular bass line on a modern instrument might, you go to conservatory for years trying to find a way of making every note sound the same volume, the same attack, and trying to persuade people out of that and to say, well, no, I mean, there is a hierarchy here in this, there's a rhythmic hierarchy within a bar, there's a hierarchy over the phrase lengths, and even within the instruments, are we going to hit the lower octave, or are we going to try and make the lower octave as strong as in even at the top? I'm referring to the cello now. Wind players, again, that aesthetic of the seamless, beautiful line, which really just did not exist before the 90s. I would even argue it didn't exist in the so-called era of so-called bel canto in Italian opera. So it's been a journey to encourage people to allow the oddness, the idiosyncrasy, and the unevenness of the music to shine through, I would say.
Good, thank you very much. I think there are many here in the audience who actually are very experienced in listening to a wide range of music. And if there are any questions, we're very happy to take on 2 or 3 questions from the audience, please.
Yeah, go on.
Yes, please.
What's your question?
Sorry?
Give me the question.
Yes?
It could be anything. What size shoes am I wearing? Okay.
Why didn't you choose one of Bach's concertos to perform tonight? Why didn't you choose one of Bach's concertos to perform tonight?
Why didn't we choose a Bach concerto tonight?
I think Bach was mentioned at one point, wasn't it?
Yeah.
That's a good question. I mean, you're a Bach fan, obviously. I think I was keen to find music, I was kind of keen to finish with Beethoven symphonies. It's something I like doing, and have done a fair amount of, directing from the violin 1 and 2, and I haven't done 3 yet, but 4 and 5 and 6. so that sort of took care of the second half. Given the sort of the ethos behind Resound Collective, I thought it would be nice to at least point up the notion of soloist or concertante group in contrast with the larger body. So one immediately thinks of concerti grossi. So I thought, well, that's a nice thing to have, and the Handel Opus 6s are. I mean, although he didn't by any means originate the form or the genre of the concerto grosso, that's something that came out of Italy towards just after the middle of the 17th century. But it seemed a good way to start off, and then just taking that that notion forward, the idea of chamber and versus hall, if you like. The Haydn Sinfonia Concertante seemed a good idea. So that's a group of 4 soloists, contrasted in a different way than in a concerto grosso. That's much more operatic, I suppose, certainly in the conversation, the musical conversation that happens between the 4 soloists, and the orchestral tuttis are very operatic, I would say. Adding a Bach concerto to that, I don't know, it just didn't seem to fit somehow. So that was the reasoning behind the program. I hope you're not too disappointed.
I think also as a comment, this group has played a wide range of music. We've done quite a bit of Mozart. We've done 2 Beethoven piano concertos. We've done Stravinsky, Ligeti, Bartok. The day will come for sure when we're doing Bach. I think there's no doubt about it. Early next year, we'll do a lot of Italian Baroque, as well as other more modern Italian music. So the thing is, the repertoire for the chamber ensemble and the chamber orchestra is really huge. It's really huge, and we could spend many, many years without repeating any of these works. So, and we can only hold 4, at most 5 concerts a year. Just let us know what you like to hear. We'll be happy to.
You're doing requests.
Yeah, we'll be happy to consider it. Another question? Yes.
Only do Baroque? Do you do Renaissance or modern?
Absolutely, yes. I do all sorts of music. I've played everything from the dawn of bowed instruments. I spent a lot of time. This is going to show my age now, but from the late 70s, 78, 79, right through till about 1990, I was involved with a medieval music group, and that was the first thing that got me into period instruments, actually, was listening to medieval and Renaissance music. And I was playing very weird instruments called viels and fiddles and rebecks. Going forward, yes, absolutely. I mean, I've never not played the modern violin. I mean, just less so in performing in public, but I mean, I was part of the session world in London in the early 80s for a while. I did work with the LSO for a good long time on leaving college. Orchestra of St. John Smith Square was another one. And I'm interested in all sorts of music. Like I was saying before, I think you'll find people, involved in the historical instrument world are not, they're not monks and nuns, devoted to sort of some particular approach to music. You'll easily, I know a natural trumpeter who's a mad death metal fan. He knows more about that genre than I do. My thing was progressive rock music. That's what the 70s was for me, and still is. But yes, modern music. The music I listen to is often that played by dead violinists of the golden age, the Jascha Heifertzes, the Milsteins, the David Nadians, the list goes on and on and on. But yeah, I listen and play to as much as I possibly can. I've got a bit of a blind spot when it comes to hip-hop, that's I have to say.
I would say also, similarly within the orchestra, one of our bassists is regularly playing jazz, and one of the violinists is part of this group which you may have heard of called the Lorong Boys. So Lorong Boys, you know, are not necessarily classical, they're a bit of a mixed genre, and many of our players also play for musical theater. So I think it's sometimes dangerous to just think of musicians being concentrated on a single genre.
Yeah, I would just add by the same token. I mean, I mentioned Heifetz. Heifetz was very keen on light music and actually wrote quite a few songs. One of the names escaped me, but one was a big hit. He had a pseudonym, Fred Hoyle, I believe was his name, as a songwriter. And Bing Crosby, I think, recorded that piece. So he was into light music. Alfredo Campoli was another one who had a light ensemble. And one only has to think of Fritz Kreisler as well. It's a different kind of light music, but you know, they weren't too churchy about it. The gentleman over there had something to ask.
As a conductor, one of the most frightening things you learn in life is that gesture matters. And some of the best lessons that I have learned have often been with poor conductors, be they professional or amateur, and I've learned some very valuable lessons. I'm just curious from your perspective as both performer and director and leader, what are some of the either the great lessons learned of things to do or not to do when you observe the conducting community?
Yeah, fantastic question, and maybe to do it justice, I would need longer and a sort of lecture demo. Speaking purely subjectively, I would say, by and large, it's to do with the whole thing of less is more. I mentioned earlier that, you know, overdoing gestures and overdoing the brusqueness of a gesture, particularly with the bow arm, is just death for your playing. I would say the most, in my experience playing for conductors, and you know, I don't have anything like the experience of somebody who's been playing or leading a symphony orchestra for years and years and years. But in the LSO times, you know, I did get to play with some great people. One maestro who sticks out is the wonderful Gennady Roszczewski, who's, I'll just demonstrate his main conducting technique. You know what I'm talking about, and I mean with complex scores. The you know, Rite of Spring, various of the more tricky Shostakovich and Rachmaninoff scores that we played with him. He would do the absolute minimum to force people into a place where they just had to listen for their dear lives, you know. So that's I would say that would be my general approach. I suppose it speaks to the whole notion of interpretation in quotation marks. I think if one is directing a performance as a conductor, purely, there would be more room for that sort of, you know, interpretation per se. What I mean, there is definitely a distinct, I hope, a distinct approach to these pieces tonight, which will come through. But it's more as a result of all the little tiny bits of knowledge and habits and feelings that I've developed about this music over the years. I wouldn't. Maybe this is the wrong thing to say, but I wouldn't call it my interpretation as a thing on its own. It will. Hopefully, it'll be different from the rehearsals. Because working with an orchestra in the way we have done over this week, the idea has been to allow room for things to happen and to go wrong even, and to not worry about it too much.
Well, I'm sure there's little to worry about, Pavlo. Thank you very much for your attention. We'll clear the hall now and allow Pavlo to go back and prepare, and we'll see you at 8:15, and I hope you enjoy the concert. Thank you very much.